New reporting from the Washington Post on just how sensitive some of the documents recovered from Mar-a-Lago actually were. Now, I'm quoting from the headline of the Washington Post: material on foreign nations' nuclear capabilities seized at Trump's Mar-a-Lago. The subhead reading, some seized documents were so closely held only the president, a cabinet level or near cabinet level official could authorize others to know. Now, we're trying to connect with one of the reporters on the story right now. There's also this just in. Senate Intelligence Committee Chairman Mark Warner says he and his members are expecting a briefing soon from the intelligence community on sensitive documents recovered from Mar-a-Lago. Chairman Warner indicating to CNN's Manu Raju that he is trying to get an update without waiting for a final report. Meantime, on Judge Aileen Cannon's ruling that a special master be appointed to review the materials for items covered by executive or attorney-client privilege, listen to what the former president's attorney general said about it last night on Fox.
The opinion, I think, was wrong, and I think the government should appeal it. It's deeply flawed in a number of ways. I don't think the appointment of a special master is going to hold up.
When or whether an appeal comes is one question. Whether it should is another. So is the question of whether Judge Cannon's ruling gives the former president better treatment than others might get under similar circumstances. Let's talk about it with former federal judge Nancy Gertner. She's now a senior lecturer at Harvard Law School. Also CNN political commentator David Urban, who served as political strategist to the former president, and Jennifer Rogers, CNN legal analyst and former federal prosecutor. Jennifer, first of all, on the Washington Post reporting, again, we don't have more details other than what the Washington, or we can't independently confirm what the Washington Post is reporting, but on just the high-level nature of some of the information that was found at Mar-a-Lago.
Well, it's consistent with some of the reporting we've heard before that there are very, very high-level, highly classified documents found at Mar-a-Lago. Nuclear secrets are among the most closely held in government, of course. So, this is consistent with what's been out there, although with more detail. I do wonder how it's getting out and who's leaking it. I think it's problematic if those leaks are coming from inside the government. But in terms of the government's case, listen, this is the kind of document that you would charge a case about. And it's not a document that's going to be subject to any sort of executive privilege or attorney-client privilege. So when you think about documents that are going to be available to the government to charge criminally, if they choose, this is the sort of document you're talking about.
I want to bring in Devlin Barrett, who is one of the reporters on the byline on the Washington Post reporting. Can you just talk about what you have learned?
Right. So we have learned that when the FBI conducted its search on August 8th, obviously there's been court documents describing a lot of classified material that was taken. We're told that one of the things found in the course of that search was a document that described a foreign government's military defenses, including its nuclear capabilities. And obviously that was a cause for some concern, although there's a lot of material in this tranche of stuff that they searched for and found that is a cause for concern.
And in the article, you detailed the kind of procedures which would normally be put in place to protect such a document.
Right. So we're talking the most serious category of this type of information is what's referred to often as special access programs.
So this is above top secret clearances.
It's sort of a very tight circle within the larger circle of top secret, if that makes sense. It's a type of top secret information that in what's been described to us as some of the SAP material that was seized was so close hold that only the president, some cabinet secretaries, and near cabinet-like officials were authorized to share or allow other people in the government to see that kind of information. So extremely close hold, extremely tightly held, and there was an allusion to this in one of the court filings. If you remember, one of the filings said that even the investigators who recovered the material, some of them weren't, even though they were counterintelligence agents, some of them weren't authorized to review some of the documents when they first found them.
So some of the FBI agents who were on the scene in Mar-a-Lago, they didn't even have the kind of clearance that would allow them to look at these documents.
Correct, and not just the agents. Some of the federal prosecutors involved in this matter also didn't automatically have a clearance to look at some of this material. That's how close hold it was.
And you talk about close hold, who would be able to see it and who would grant that authorization, whether it's either the president or a cabinet level or near cabinet level official. These are also documents that how they are stored, obviously, a lot of thought is put into that.
Right. You're talking about documents that should be stored in a SCIF. It's a government acronym for a very secure room, and should have someone who's designated, a government official designated, to keep very close tabs on those kinds of documents. That's another cause for concern, because obviously when they conducted this search, they looked in a storage room, they looked in the former president's office, and those aren't nearly the kinds of places with the kinds of security for documents like that.
Has the former president's legal team responded to your request for comment?
We have not heard back from them yet. Obviously, when we've done prior reporting on this question of nuclear weapons material, nuclear weapons information, the president called it a hoax, and in that same statement suggested that evidence was planted on him by the FBI agents.
Obviously, it's not clear why the former president would have had this information at Mar-a-Lago. There's a whole myriad of reasons, but obviously any information about the nuclear secrets of any country, there are a lot of people who would be interested to know those nuclear secrets.
Sure. I think it's such a sensitive area that there's categories and subcategories of that kind of information. Some of it is essentially Department of Defense information that falls under the classified system umbrella. And obviously, when you talk about special access programs, when you talk about nuclear capabilities of foreign military agencies, those are things that the U.S. government, in no way wants spread around.
And just to be clear, in the article, you don't name the country that the information is about. Is this the same? I mean, you've reported in the past about nuclear-related material. Is this the same material now that you're talking about with just greater clarity on it?
Well, I think what we were describing in the past story, and you can see it now in the subpoena that was unsealed since that story, is that when Trump's people were served with a subpoena for all classified information in his possession back in May, that subpoena listed a whole slew of categories of different types of classified information. But I think one of the important categories of that was information about nuclear weapons. And so they were trying to, in that subpoena, they're trying to cover the waterfront, but they're also saying, if you have any information that fits into these categories, this is the type of thing we are seeking in the subpoena that must be turned over to the government. And so this story takes it a step further and says, okay, they served the subpoena, they conducted a search, and this document that we describe is one of the things that they found in the search.
It is fascinating. Devlin Barrett, appreciate the reporting that you and your colleague Carol Leonnig did at the Washington Post on this.